Hi, I'm Katie Elias. I'm one of the managing directors of the JDRF T1D Fund. We're a venture philanthropy fund, a $200 million AUM evergreen fund that is the venture arm of a philanthropy focused on type 1 diabetes. And that's the T1D is for type 1 diabetes. We've been around since late 2016, and we're working on investing in cures and treatments for the type 1 population. So in terms of our focus and how we operate, the fund has been around for 7 or 8 years now, really got kind of ramped up over the first 3 years as we were raising capital, as we were going. Again, we're an evergreen, open-ended fund, and we recycle all proceeds. So we're a fund that doesn't distribute our returns to investors. We have philanthropic donors who care about curing the disease that we're focused on, and as a result, all proceeds get recycled into the fund for future deployment. That means we have to be very careful with the math in terms of both money out the door and then returns coming in. We do plan for reserves for our companies, and so we try to chart that out from the beginning. When we got started, I think we were writing some smaller checks to begin with, maybe a million or slightly under, slightly over. Now, again, we're writing checks that are more in the 3 to 5 million in the first go typically, but we plan to follow on for later. And, when we go through that process, the first thing that we care about is the fit with the disease that we're there to serve. But then the rest of the criteria is the same as other investors, looking at the management team, looking at how fundable this opportunity is, and again, focusing on investing with some of the best syndicates in the space. So we're a strategic fund focused on type 1, but we try not to have too many other constraints since that's already a relatively structured thesis. We do invest in both biologics, and medical devices, diagnostic products, and some health tech, although again, our focus is looking for cures. Within that, we're pretty stage agnostic. A lot of things that we're looking at in this space are pretty early in development because we don't have too many therapies approved other than insulin therapies for the type 1 population. And so they tend to be, preclinical or early clinical stage. Our check size is usually around kind of mid-single digit millions, but we can invest up to 10 million over the life of the company. We're pretty geography agnostic, but in practice, out of our 43 investments we've made today, most of those are in the US or Western Europe. We do have some investments in Asia, out of Japan and Canada. Um, and we like to co-invest with regular way venture funds. We bring what we think is the strategic expertise, the connection to the type 1 diabetes community, and try to de-risk that indication for companies who may be only working on that and need some additional support and connection. The foundation we're a part of has been around for 50 years, making connections and inroads in that community, both with patients, clinicians, regulators, et cetera. But also for companies that have multiple indications, we try to bring, again, that level of knowledge and connection to the resources that are going to help them be successful in the indication that we're there to pay attention to. When we think about, as a strategic investor, what does that mean when companies potentially change strategies? Because I think that comes up a lot in strategic focused funds, whether it's a corporate venture capital fund or a disease focused fund or whatever other flavor. I think there's this inherent tension in those funds between the first investment, when clearly the opportunity was on strategy, otherwise you wouldn't have done it, and some future date at which that might be not so true anymore, either because your organization has changed strategy or because the company has changed strategy, sometimes for very good market-driven reasons. Then what do you do? And I think, it's important to have some rules of engagement with your portfolio companies at the outset to be able to set expectations for whichever your investment policy or thesis is going to be. And so for us, I think, again, we're a mission-focused, T1D indication-focused fund, but we do have the ability to follow on to make sure that we're being good, corporate citizens, good members of the board, good investors. We know that when people are going out to raise money, if insiders are not participating in the round, it has a negative signal value to the broader ecosystem. And so we really try to balance those things when we're making decisions about follow-on investments. So we always put in reserves for future investments. It's not a one and done situation, but then at that moment in time, we'll kind of re-examine where the company is in its strategy. And we also have legal language written in to say, if at a future point in time you've discontinued work in the indication that we care about, which is up to you to decide. Again, if we're on the board, we're going to be having conversations about why is that appropriate. But if that's the decision, we're not here to change your decision. And at the same time, it may make us think about how much we're interested in following on in the future. But we're really not here to kill companies that are doing good work. And again, they're very market driven, appropriate reasons for making some indication selection decisions. So, something that we've seen in the wave that we've been following in the financing ecosystem over the last several years around the macro is when there was a lot of capital, people were adding a lot of indications. And now when capital is tighter, you're having to make some tough choices. And again, sometimes if you were the third or fourth indication added to something, you're one of the first to get cut. Doesn't apply as much in medtech. For the most part, these are not platform technology companies. They're already going after some pretty specific indications, but we see some of that in medtech as well, where so you might see somebody in our case looking in diabetes, but also in wellness, maybe within diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. And so we do make those kind of considerations as we're thinking about follow-ons. I think when you're looking at founding teams, there's a couple of different flavors that I tend to find attractive. And again, this is informed by doing this job in different flavors and forms at different funds over the last 15 years of my career and learning from some great mentors. But I think you have the seasoned executives who have seen this before, they've seen the movie before, they know how it works, and then they're able to assemble custom-made teams, bringing in talents from different parts of the ecosystem. And you know that you can trust them because they've watched the movie. I think that's one flavor. And ideally, here in Europe, we have more and more of these repeat entrepreneurs who can help educate the broader community around how to do things. In the US, and again, I started my investing career in Europe, so that was the model that I was growing up in. In the US, there were already more of those available, and so more repeat entrepreneurs to mentor and train the next generation of entrepreneurs. I think the other flavor are, of course, first-time teams or first-time entrepreneurs. And, I love investing in really passionate first-time CEOs or first-time entrepreneurs. But what's really key in my mind in those situations is that there's the right dose of humility and understanding that there's a lot to know that you might not know yet, and being okay with that, and understanding that you need to bring in the right expertise and advisors, and maybe it's board members, maybe it's a CTO, or in some cases a CFO who's seen this before, so that you're not learning everything from scratch on the fly. Because there are, startups have very limited time and budgets to achieve what they're trying to do. And if everybody on the team has never seen the movie before, it can go off the rails pretty quickly. And so I think, we've had fantastic experiences working with first-time entrepreneurs. One of my biggest both personal and financial successes in my current fund was working with a PhD student out of Caltech who, has never had a job outside of working in the lab and then starting a company, but he was incredibly focused and savvy about bringing in the right expertise. First of all, having an incredible idea and being passionate about it, but then bringing the right professionals to support him and to challenge him and to coach him. One of the pitfalls for entrepreneurs when they're pitching is to not do their homework on who they're talking to. And I'm sure you hear that a lot, but it really doesn't take that long to go on somebody's website, no matter how bad their website is, and just try to read if there's some information about the kinds of things they're interested in. And as you might imagine, we probably feel this more acutely than other people because we do have a very specific investment focus where it has to have something to do with type 1 diabetes. So the number of outreach that I get, and again, as an investor, I'm intellectually curious and interested in a lot of things, and I'm generally pretty happy to be helpful to connect people. But if you're coming and pitching my fund and trying to tell me why your solution is a great fit for us, but you haven't bothered to find out that T1D stands for type 1 diabetes and that's what we do, it's a pet peeve, right? You just do the 2 seconds of homework. So this is a very basic one, but I think the other piece of that is if somebody's coming to me to talk about a type 1 diabetes opportunity, and that's all I think about all day in this job, maybe when I tell you to move through your market slides around why it's an unmet need, because I kind of know that part, entrepreneurs who can't adapt their pitch to the audience, again, doesn't have to be about diabetes. In my previous roles, I was in Sofinova, we were investors in CoreValve. The number of people came in and wanted to tell me that they were the next CoreValve. I was like, okay, why don't we focus on what you're doing and what's differentiated? I just think it's hard for entrepreneurs to get used to tailoring their talk track based on who they're in front of. And that's something that they should spend a little more time doing. I think one of the discussions that we had earlier today is around the role of the consumer and the balance between the consumer and the patient in medtech and healthcare more broadly. And diabetes is one of the venues where I think that's playing out because patients and people with diabetes potentially kick off a huge amount of data. And how do we leverage that data to deliver better patient outcomes? And at the same time, again, there's people who are pre-diabetes on the type 2 side that, you know, there's a prevention aspect to managing and monitoring those. So I think in that context, how we look at leveraging data that patients and people in the community are generating and to gather insights from that to impact health is still something that we're seeing. And diabetes has been a space where that's been happening for a long time. Even after you've been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes or type 2, you see your endocrinologist twice a year for 15 minutes, but you're living with your disease every day and having to make treatment decisions every day about managing your condition. And so it's a very data rich, but also a very consumer kind of personal set of decisions that we're making in that space. And so I think looking at opportunities and companies that recognize that element of patient care and how to work that into, the workflows of the healthcare ecosystem are going to do well. So one thing that's really interesting right now in the ecosystem is still this, let's say, misinformation around the impact of some of the obesity drugs and diabetes drugs like the GLP-1s and all of the GLPs and what that's going to mean for the medtech community. And I think if we dial back, a year or so ago when some of these GLPs started to make so much headlines, inroads, and have incredible commercial results, you saw things like the stocks of the diabetes medtech companies get hit. And that was a really interesting phenomenon for us to watch as people who pay very close attention to this industry, because I think, it's just belies a lack of sophistication around the understanding of who the patient populations are and ultimately, who are they serving today? Where is the growth going to come from? And how do these different therapies get combined? Because at the end of the day, I think GLPs are amazing. They have some incredible health benefits well beyond diabetes and obesity, but that doesn't mean there's no market for insulin. And I think one of the things that we've seen, and again, maybe there's been more education about this in the last year, and some of those stocks on the medtech side have recovered, but maybe not fully, is that it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to get people off of insulin. There's, by the way, still a huge insulin-dependent community out there, and those people requiring insulin still have unmet needs that are not going to be fully served by the GLPs. By the way, GLPs are also not indicated for people with type 1 diabetes. So there's plenty of them taking them off-label, or they're taking them for an obesity indication, but it's in different dosing than a type 2 population. So I think, I encourage people to, like any disease, dig a few layers deeper when they're thinking about the macro trends and the combination of, pharma, biotech therapies with medtech. It's not an either or, right? It's about tailoring the right solution for individual patient populations. And there are some great candidates for even GLPs in a type 2 or obesity setting, but who can't tolerate those medications in their current forms. And they need other solutions as well. So again, I don't think it's an either or in terms of insulin producing companies and tech related to insulin therapy versus GLPs. I think these are going to have to work together in combination. Yeah, I think if we look towards closing out this year and into the next, one of the key things that we're focused on is the companies that we've already invested in that may be, running shorter on capital because of where we are in the macroeconomic cycle. And again, we're in an election year. We don't know how that's going to go. The markets have mostly been closed on the IPO side. In medtech, maybe even more so than biotech. And so how do we make sure that the companies that we've invested in that we think are doing a good job and are really meaningful for patients, how can they kind of cross the chasm to the next side and to get hopefully to the other end of the financing cycle? And so we're spending a lot of time with our existing portfolio, as I'm sure a lot of investors already are, trying to kind of focus our attention on the potential winners and to maybe spend a little less time on the ones that feel like, it's not a good use of your time. I think it's always a trap in venture to spend more of your time on the companies that are crying for help more as opposed to investing in your winners. And so I think there's some triage going on in the industry now. And for us, it's about, really looking at the science and the progress that the companies have made. What data generation have they achieved? Where have they got on their development path? And where do we feel like, success is possible in this environment? And then being thrifty, deciding which other projects that would be nice to have maybe could wait until we're in a different less capital constrained environment.